thank you for agreeing to be interviewed. I'm actually really excited to ask you some of these questions, not put you to the question, but ask you some of these questions. So first up is, can you share with us a little bit about who you are and what you are currently doing?
Thanks, Erin, for taking on the role of interviewer. I'll interview you later, but for now, yes, I'm Graeme Chatfield, and I used to teach Baptist history and history generally at Morling College in New South Wales. Then I worked with the Australian College of Theology for a number of years, and as of December a little while ago, last year, the year before, I retired. And so now I'm just doing my own, thing in a few different areas. And this 500th anniversary of Anabaptism has become a project that I'm pretty passionate about promoting.
I like hearing that. Look, until you spoke to me about it, I didn't know that it was happening, and I was wondering if anyone was going to do something. So I'm pretty excited as well.
So the European Baptist Federation was already doing some things, but a friend of mine called Martin Rothkagel, and he's also a member of the Baptist World Alliance Heritage and Identity Commission that I'm part of. We have got together and decided that we need to push this forward so that the rest of the world that doesn't speak German knows what's going on.
Fantastisch. And that about sums up my German. But no, I think that's let's make it accessible in a few more languages, shall we? So I think that leads into the first of the more Anabaptist-oriented questions. When did you first become aware of Anabaptism or the Anabaptists?
So I was taught Reformation history by a man known as John Tonkin, Dr. John Tonkin at the University of Western Australia. And he, in his general overview of the Reformation, gave us a little bit of an insight into Anabaptism. And there was another person in Perth, Reverend Dr. Noel Vos, who was the principal of Perth Baptist Theological College. And I did my honours year with his wife, Heather, who was actually studying history as well. And he invited me to come along to Perth Bible Baptist Theological College and give a short lecture. So that was my introduction to lecturing as well. And he asked me if I would
Baptism
like to write. Yeah, he asked me if I'd like to pursue studying Hutterite educational theory. And it was like, okay, but I'm a little bit more interested in Luther's concept of the sword and the two states and whatever else. So I didn't follow that up at that stage. But that's sort of where the introduction to Anabaptism and Anabaptist studies started. That was back in those honours undergraduate years.
I love that. So a calling straight into something like the Hutterite Chronicles, but then look, I still really like Luther, so we'll go with that first, at the same time as being thrown in the deep end of lecturing in the small Baptist world. I like that.
That's pretty much the summary.
Yeah. So I guess you've kind of already started to touch on this, but what attracted you to studying Anabaptism?
So the stuff about church and state and the concept of Christendom and reading some of the Anabaptist primary sources about pacifism and those sorts of ideas all came to a bit of a head when I had the opportunity to take up a scholarship to go and study at Bristol University. And I was going to look at this Anabaptist guy, Balthasar Hubmaier, who has a somewhat different view on the relationship of church and state and the use of the sword which makes him something of an enigma or ambiguity in Anabaptist studies. So some people don't know if they want him in or out, whether he is or he isn't. But from my understanding of the basic definition of Anabaptism in terms of those who were seen to rebaptise because infant baptism wasn't considered the correct interpretation of Scripture, confessor's baptism was the way it should be interpreted. And he was very much an Anabaptist in that sense, though he had some other views. So that's where that started. And instead of actually working on Hubmaier and the sword, once I got to Bristol, the PhD changes, as most PhD theses do.
Because they do that, yeah.
And I wound up writing on the concept of the clarity of Scripture that Hubmaier had, and comparing that with Luther and with Zwingli and with Hans Denk. So that was what happened back then in whenever it was.
So that also then answers my next question, but I'll ask it anyway in case you want the chance to get a little bit more specific. So was there a specific aspect of Anabaptism that you studied? And so you just said that the thesis changed to the clarity of Scripture. Do you want to give me a little bit more information on, say, maybe some of the key differences between Hubmaier and Zwingli or Luther or?
Yeah, so clarity of Scripture was where the thesis took me, and the concept of hermeneutics and how that works. People can read the book if they want to about the detail on that, because I've sort of moved beyond that into one of the.
This?
Yeah, that's the book.
Yeah, that's the one.
Thank you for that.
Anytime.
The thing that it's moved on to is the concept of congregational hermeneutics that underpins and drives Hubmaier's concept of the clarity of Scripture. So Scripture becomes clear for him when the whole of the community gathers together to converse about the meaning of a text. There's a place for the learned one to provide their input, but it's the community as a whole who comes to their conclusion as to what this text means. And so that marries up very closely with my understanding of Baptist congregational governance and how hermeneutics in the congregation should work. So that's sort of grown out of the thesis.
I think some of this will come out in when you interview me, but it's a really interesting time to be discussing this, because I now think of everything through the lens of what's happening in our own denomination. So to hear coming together with our Bibles open and to discern together the meaning of Scripture, or to discern together the mind of Christ, as Baptists like to say, is that's very encouraging for me to hear.
Well, let's see if we can put it into practice.
I hope and pray. So that also dovetails really nicely into my next question, which is, what contribution has your study of Anabaptism made to your Baptist identity?
Yeah, so I think it's reinforced that whole concept of the need for the congregation as a whole to be biblically literate, and for that process to be open for the congregation to engage with that. It's made me a little more cautious about a leadership style that would have a magisterium type approach, where the leaders are the only ones who
increasing magisterium.
Yeah, we've had enough of magisteriums, in my view. But that's sort of where that's dovetailing into the current context in Australia that I'm familiar with, in particular. Anyway,
yeah. So I think we can leave our own context for for a little while for people all over the rest of the world, and I might speak to that in another interview. But I think let's get back to why it is we're excited about this and why it is we want to celebrate and commemorate the 500-year anniversary. So why should Baptists commemorate 500 years since the baptisms in Zurich?
There's been a debate about how much influence or on the origins of Baptists that Anabaptists had, and people can follow that through. But it seems to me that whether we want to track through primary sources specific influence, or whether it was culturally in the air at that time, we do know for a fact that in the 1640s, when the particular Baptists were trying to figure out how to do baptism, they actually went back to see some Mennonites to figure out what was going on. And so our whole concept of baptism by immersion and what the symbolism of all that meant has direct linkage to that particular group of Mennonites, apart from Smith and Co. being with the Waterlanders back in Amsterdam earlier than that, back in 1609. So we have links, and we think we need, I think, to understand what our history is and where it's come from. That doesn't necessarily want to say we were the beginning of it all and there was nothing else out there. And those very brave people in Zurich that a lot of them wound up dead as a consequence of standing up for being rebaptised, although they denied that fervently. That there's an opportunity for us, to celebrate what their sacrifice meant, but also around a whole range of other ideas that we as Baptists and they as Anabaptist Mennonites now share. So I think it's a good thing to do.
I agree. And I will say more about that in another interview. But before I thank you for your time and your knowledge and your wisdom, was there anything else that you're itching to say or burning to get out that I didn't give you an opportunity to say?
No, I think what I'll do is I'll give you some reading. How could I be a teacher of this stuff and not give a reading list?
Well, in that case, let's start with, if you wanted to give a general introduction to someone maybe not so familiar with Anabaptists or Anabaptism, where would you start?
I think people enjoy story more than text sometimes in that sense. And there's a guy called John Allen Moore who wrote Anabaptist Profiles. Now, it's quite an old book. About 1984 it was produced, and people have produced others similarly. But he gives a potted biographical sketch of 6 fundamental, important, foundational Anabaptist people. And that would give people a bit of an idea about the story of Anabaptism, where it starts. I think that's a good place for people to start.
Narrative is, I think, can be more interesting or more accessible, but also I think sometimes if we're able to kind of hook facts or ideas or understanding onto a personality, that can be really helpful as well. So I like that.
The other one,
and so for those of us, go.
Sorry, the other one that I'd talk about is a guy called Hans-Jürgen Goetz, and he wrote a book called The Anabaptists. It's come out again in another edition, in the English translation edition in 1996. So it's quite old. But what he does is bring it from a different perspective that people might want to utilise, which is a socio-political economic interpretation of Anabaptism, rather than just the theology debates. And that's a useful one as well. For anybody who really wants to jump into dealing with not just the group we know as the Anabaptists, but the whole of the radical Reformation, you just can't go past George Hunston Williams' absolute tome called The Radical Reformation, which has been reprinted in all sorts of things. Latest versions come out in 2000 at around about 1,500 pages or more. It's a monolith,
yeah,
but it's brilliant.
It's thorough.
It's thorough, yeah. Yeah. And the other thing that I'd point people to has been the reissue of the Classics of the Radical Reformation series. They used to be put out by Herald Press. They're now being put out by the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, relaunched in 2020. So if you want to read primary sources of Anabaptist writers in English translation, because we're not all clever enough to read Old German or Latin, then this would be a classic for people to be able to jump into, to read primary sources of these Anabaptist guys. Sadly, not too many women, though you get a few women's voices coming through in the documents about the Swiss Brethren.
I'm glad you said that, because I would like to speak about a few women later.
Excellent, excellent. So there we are. That's a little bit of reading, and of course there'll be an exam afterwards. No.
So for any of you watching the interview, I think we didn't say earlier that I've worked with Graeme in 2 different settings, but he was also my lecturer. And so when he said there's going to be an exam, I still felt that stab of panic.
Yes. Well, there's no exam. It's just reading for the fun of it this time, Erin.
And I still do, still reading or going down research rabbit holes not related to anything I should be doing for the fun of it. Well, okay. Thank you very much for your time. This has been great. It has been enlightening and knowledgeable and fun, and I thank you for that.
Thanks, Erin.